Jai Hind everyone. I am Dublish, Assistant Professor in MCA Department in Akgec Engineering College. Today my topic of lecture is Spring Boot, which is a topic of web technology, and the lecture is for MCA and CSIT student. Now, what is Spring Boot? So Spring Boot is a project that is built on the top of the Spring framework. Also, it provides an easier and faster way to set up, configure, and run both simple and web-based application. So it is a Spring module that provides the RED application development features to the Spring framework. Also, it is used to create a standalone Spring-based application that you can just run because it needs minimal Spring configuration. So Spring Boot is basically, in short, we can say Spring framework plus embedded HTTP servers like Tomcat and JT, and we can reduce XML configuration. Now, what is Spring Boot? So, in short, we can say Spring Boot is a combination of Spring framework and embedded servers. So, in Spring Boot, there is no requirement for XML configuration deployment descriptor. It uses convention over configuration software design paradigm. That means it decreases the effort of the developer. So we can use Spring STS IDE or Spring Initializer to develop Spring Boot Java application. So why should we use Spring Boot framework? So a dependency injection approach is used in Spring Boot. So also it contains powerful database transaction management capabilities. It simplifies integration with other Java framework like JPA, Hypernet, ORM, and struts. Also it reduces the cost and development time of the application. Now, what are the advantages of Spring Boot? Basically, it creates a standalone Spring application that can be started using Java ZAR. Also, it tests web application easily with the help of different embedded HTTP servers such as Tomcat, Jetty, etc. Also, we don't need to deploy ZAR files. It provides opinionated starter form to simplify our Maven configuration. It provides production-ready features such as matrices, health checks, and externalized configuration. So there is no requirement for XML configuration. Also, it offers a CLI tool for developing and testing the Spring Boot application. It offers a number of plugins. We can say minimize writing multiple boilerplate code. The code that has to be included in many places with little or no alternation. Also, XML configuration and automation. It increases productivity and reduces development time. Now, what are the limitations of Spring Boot? Spring Boot can use dependencies that are not going to be used in the application. This dependency increases the size of the application. So, the prerequisites of Spring Boot are to create a Spring Boot application. We need Java 1.8, Maven 3.0 plus, and Spring Framework 5.0.0 build a snapshot. Also an IDE, Spring Boot suite is recommended. Now, what is Spring Boot architecture? So the Spring Boot module is of the Spring framework. It is used to create a standalone production grade Spring Boot application with minimum effort. It is developed on top of the core Spring framework. Spring Boot follows a layered architecture in which each layer communicates with the layer directly below or above in hierarchical structure. So we have presentation layer, business layer, persistence layer, and database layer. Now, in database means actual database, we have presentation layer used for storage logic, and business layer used for business logic validation and authorization, and presentation layer used for authentication, JSON translation. Now, the Spring Boot architecture. So the Spring Boot architecture, flow architecture, we have client, controller, service layer, model. And so client is directly connected to send to the request sent to the controller, and controller attached with the service layer, and this is attached by the model, and model attached directly to the database. And service layer is used dependency injection to repository class extended thread services. So this is how Spring Boot flow architecture works. Now the Spring Boot use all the module of Spring like Spring MVC, Spring Data, etc. So that the architecture of Spring Boot is the same as the architecture of the Spring MVC, except one thing that there is no need for DO AO and DO implementation class in Spring Boot. So create a data access layer and perform CRUD operation. So the client makes the HTTP request put or GET. So first the request goes to the controller and the controller maps that request and handle it. After that, it calls the service logic if required. In the service layer, all the business logic performs, and if it performs the logic on the data, that is mapped to the Java with model class. So a GSP page is returned to the user if no error occurred. Now the configuration which we for downloading Spring Boot configuration, we should follow the following step. First one is, so firstly we have to create a Maven project with the help of Spring initialization. For this we have to use start.spring.io, and we need to add some dependency. First one is Spring Web, MySQL, Hibernate, JPA, and then generate the project and download the zip file. So after this, we have to import the project as existing Maven project into Spring Tool suite. After this, we have to wait for some time for the installation of dependency. Then remove it till then you are not using JPA, otherwise it may show some error from pom.xml. Then execute as a Spring Boot app and send request to the Postman or browser localhost 8080. After that, it return not found error because we have not defined controller. Then we have to create a class for controller, use @REST controller annotation with the class, and define a method with get mapping annotation. So this is how we can configure Spring Boot. So what are the Spring Boot annotation? So Spring Boot annotation is a form of metadata that provides data about a program. In other words, we can say annotation are used to provide supplemental information about a program. So it is not a part of the application that we develop. It does not have a direct effect on the operation of the code that annotate. So it does not change the action of the compiled program. So the core Spring Framework annotation can also use here. Apart from those following are exclusively used with Spring Boot. First one, we have @enable auto configuration. It auto configure the beans that is present in the class path and configure it to the run the method. So the use of the annotation is reduced in Spring Boot 1.2.0 release because developer provide an alternative of an annotation, that is Spring Boot and application. Second one is @Spring Boot application. It is a combination of three annotation: @enable auto configuration, @component scan, and @configuration. Last one is request mapping. It is used to map the web request. It has many options to element like consumes, header, method, name, params, path, produce, and values. So we use it with the class as well as method. Get mapping we use. It maps the HTTP GET request on the specific handler method. It is used to create a web service endpoint that fetches it. It is used instead of using @request mapping, and the method we use request method.get. And the post mapping, it maps the HTTP post request on the specific handler method. It is used to create a web service endpoint that it used to instead of using @request mapping. Method which we used is request method.post. Put mapping, it maps the HTTP put request on the specific handler method. Also, it is used to create a web service endpoint that creates or update. It is used to instead of using @request mapping, and the method which we used are request method.put. Delete mapping, it maps the HTTP delete request on the specific handler method. It is used to create a web service endpoint that delete a resource. Also, it is used instead of using @request mapping. Method which we used is request method.delete. Patch mapping we used. It is mapped the HTTP patch request on the specific handler method. It is used instead of using @request mapping method. And we use request method.patch. So request body, it is used to bind HTTP request with an object in a method parameter. Internally, it is used HTTP message converters to convert the body of the request. When we annotate a method parameter with @request body, the Spring Framework binds the incoming HTTP request body to that parameter. Request body, it binds the method return value to the response body. It tells the Spring Boot framework to serialize or return an object into JSON and XML format. Path variable, it is used to extract the values from the URL. It is most suitable for the RESTful API web services where the URL contains a path variable. and we can define multiple path variable in a method. Request param, it is used to extract the query matter from the URL. Also, it is also known as query parameter. It is more suitable for web's application, and it can specify default value if the query parameter is not present in the URL. Request header, it is used to get the details about the HTTP header, and we use this annotation as a method parameter. So this optional element of the annotation are name, required value, default value. For each detail in the header, we should specify separate annotation, and we can use it multiple times in a method. The REST controller annotation can be considered as a combination of address controller and response body annotation. The REST controller annotation is self-annotated by the response body annotation, and it eliminates the need for annotating each method with response body. Request attribute, it bind a method parameter to request attribute. It provides convenient access to the request attribute from a controller method. The Spring Boot framework, it includes a number of additional features that help us to monitor and manage the Spring Boot application. It contains the actual endpoint, the place where the resource live. So we can use HTTP and JMX endpoint to manage and monitor the Spring Boot application. So if we want to get production ready features in an application, we should use the Spring Boot actuator. So the features of Spring Boot actuator are basically endpoint, matrices, and audit. So endpoint actuator allow us to monitor and interact with the application. So Spring Boot provide a number of built-in endpoints. We can also create our own point. We can enable and disable endpoint individually. Most of the application choose HTTP, where the ID of the endpoint along with the prefix of actuator is mapped to a URL. For example, the health endpoint provide the basic health information of an application, though the actuator by default mapped it to actuator@health. Matrices. So the Spring Boot actuator provide dimension matrices by integrating with the micrometer. The micrometer is integrated into Spring Boot. It is an instrumentation library powering the delivery of application matrices from Spring. It provides vendor neutral interface for timer, gauges, counters, distribution summaries, and long run task timers with a dimensional data model. Next is audit. So Spring Boot provide a flexible audit framework that publishes event to an audit event repository. So it automatically publishes the authentication event if Spring security is in execution. So next topic is Spring Boot runner. So Spring Boot provide two runner interface, which are application runner and command line runner. So both of these runner are used to execute piece of code when a Spring Boot application start. So both of these interfaces are functional interfaces, which means they have only one functional method in order to execute a specific piece of code when a Spring Boot application start. We need to implement either of this functional interface and override the single method of run. Application runner basically is an interface used to execute the code after the Spring Boot application started. So I'm going to tell you this how Spring application runner work by the help of this program. So for this we have to import some framework like application argument, application runner, or Spring application, Spring Boot application. Firstly, we have the Spring Boot application. For this we have Spring Boot application. We want to run in this application runner. In this we have demo application class and args. Next one we have override, in which we will throw exception. So here we want to print application runner program. Next one is logger. Logger is basically an API that provides the ability to trace out the error of the application. When an application generates the logging call, the logger records the event in the log record. After that, it sends to the corresponding handler or appenders. So Spring Boot logger gives you the following information: date and time, log levels, process ID, thread name, logger name. Now date and time, that gives the data and that gives the date and time of the log, and log level shows information, error, and warning. The hyphen is a separator. Thread name is enclosed within the square brackets, and logger name that shows the source class name and the log message. So logger so in the logger, logging is an API that provides the ability to trace out the error of the application. When an application generates the logging call, the logger record the event in the log record. After that, it sends to the corresponding handlers or appenders. So Spring Boot logger give you the these application I am going to already covered: date, time, log level, process ID, thread name, and logger name. Next one is building. We have RESTful to create building RESTful web services. So Spring Boot provide a very good support to building RESTful web services for enterprise application. For building a RESTful web services, we need to add some Spring Boot starter web dependency into the build configuration file. So if you are a Maven user, you use through filing code to add the blow dependency in your pom.xml file. So you will introduce org.spring framework boot and Spring Boot starter web. Next one is REST controller. So the REST controller annotation is used to define the RESTful web services. It serves JSON, XML, and custom response. And the syntax is REST controller public class product service controller. Next one is request mapping. So the request mapping annotation is used to define the request URL to access the request REST endpoint. So we can define request method to consume and produce object, and the default request method is get. So request mapping value should be product and the public response entity get products, and the request body annotation is used to define the request body content type. And the syntax is public response entity. Here we have object and we want to create product by request body product. Next one is we have path variable. So the path variable annotation is used to define the custom or dynamic request URL. So the path variable in request URL is defined as in curly braces. So syntax is public response entity object update product path variable ID string ID. Next one is request parameter. So the request parameter annotation is used to read the request parameter from the request URL. By default, it is a required parameter. We can also set default value for the request parameter as public response entity object and get product. Request parameter value I have here name, required is false, and default value should be I said honey, and we can write any kind of string name. So this is a simple example of creating REST web API application. So these are the basic steps for creating the Spring Boot application. Now we want to create a class as myController as follows. So I want to create a class which name is mycontroller.java. So package name should be package.com.akgc.rest akgc.rest.controller. So firstly we will have to create some method. We want to import some method. So here I have import java.utilist and that annotation auto-wired, HTTP status, response entity, delete mapping, get mapping, path variable, post mapping, put mapping, request body, REST controller. So these are the Spring Framework based annotation. So these packages firstly we have to import. Next, write any kind of mapping which would be in auto-wired condition, and then we want to get the courses. So we will return the courses name in the get courses method, which we use under the mapping of get mapping. Update APIs, here we can update some new course. We can update the course name here, and also we can delete the APIs, and after that in delete mapping we can use the exception by a try and catch.